Okay, thanks for coming back, folks. So next up, we've got Kate Orff from Scape, which is a landscape architecture firm, very involved in designing in New York Harbor, doing things like habitat generation and public involvement in these kind of spaces. And with her, she's got Philip Orton, who's from the Stevens Institute. So,
I'll just say, is this on or no? Okay. Hopefully, I will not take over. Okay, so thanks for coming. I'm Kate Orff, and it sounds like it's been an amazing day and much to discuss. So I'm going to show a mixture of projects, not only from my office, Scape, but also from the Urban Landscape Lab at Columbia, and also from design studios that that have been going on inside the walls of Avery Hall. And I've invited Philip Orton, also from the Stevens Institute, to present, and we'd like to present together because I will say that I do think that the cutting edge and some of the most interesting future ways of thinking about dredge and the reconfigured harbor is actually beginning to integrate hydrological modeling and infrastructural scenarios, and so that's what Phil is going to do and talk about. So my focus has really been in these three main areas: the Jamaica Bay Estuary, the sort of harbor interior, and the Hudson River. And I'm going to talk about each of these zones rather quickly so that we can get straight to the discussion, which is usually the most interesting part. So first, with the Jamaica Bay Estuary, I participated in a big mapping effort with Van Allen with the National Parks Conservation Association, which was looking at Gateway National Recreation Area and kind of configuring new scenarios for that. There's a big mapping exercise as part of this study, and so we began to map the kind of dynamic between cut and fill in the historic wetlands and the former wetlands. And of course, as we all know, the Army Corps of Engineers is now drawing a new map of islands, which is so beautifully illustrated in Rob Holmes and Gina Wirth's poster as you exit. You can see it as you exit. So we really focused in on Jamaica Bay, and I wrote an essay called Cosmopolitan Ecologies in the book. But the book also traces, not only the past and sort of maps the past, but focuses and shines a spotlight on student work for envisioning new scenarios for Jamaica Bay and Floyd Bennett Airfield, which has sparked some discussion and collaboration. I love showing this early map of Jamaica Bay because if you're interested in drawing, you can't even understand it from a figured ground standpoint. And this is the magic and mystery of the water-land interface, where there's no clear dividing line. It is just a giant mash of islands and eelgrass and tidal movements and erosion and deposition. And I think it's very interesting to show that image because that image was in fact a survey to build the plan that you see here, which is a plan, I believe it was from 1905, which was a plan to dredge the entire Jamaica Bay area and make it into the world's biggest port that would be bigger than the size of Rotterdam. So we all know how that went. But in fact, you can see and you can witness in the sort of bathymetry of the bay, large and deep channels that were cut that are still negatively affecting the dynamics of the water and sediment there today. I just found this to be an extreme and interesting example of the idea of dredge concepts over history and what dredge can be used for. So we began to, after the Gateway study, I began to look at run studios at Columbia centered around Jamaica Bay. And a lot of the student work, this was Nacho Riggs' work, began to look at islands, island building, sediment deployment. This is just one of his views of integrating sort of an island dynamic into the bay and kind of repopulating these disappearing islands and trying to find methodologies for re-inhabiting and remaking some of these islands. And so in some cases, and Phil is going to show some scenarios of his work with Jamaica Bay, but in some cases you can begin to see how the cumulative effect of some of these very, very small micro projects can begin to build and affect hydrology and sediment dynamics. Secondly, at the site in the Central Harbor, Scape undertook this project called Oyster Texture as part of the MoMA Rising Currents exhibit in 2010. So the idea here, and again, this was an exhibit at Vision, which tried to draw together community revitalization, reef building, and just really choreograph a reef and based on the sort of living system and the unit and the incremental change unit of the oyster. So the big idea here was that we were inspired by the life cycle of the oyster, and in a revitalized Gowanus Canal, post-Superfund, you can imagine a scenario where the Gowanus Canal could serve as an oyster nursery or a sort of a flupsy area, and those oysters could be seeded out in the Palisade Bay Reef, and you could set into motion a kind of a positive dynamic of cleaning and reef building that would build over time. And it would also have small enough increments so that the Gowanus community could be involved. So that resulted in this plan, which we used to call Back to the Future plan, because it learned from the historic patterns of sort of natural land formation, which had a lot of barrier islands and sandy shoals and so on, and concentrated circulation on the high ground. And so this kind of Back to the Future plan, of course, is a completely artificial, man-made construct, which choreographs life and sedimentation, but in a new way. So this is a sort of section view of the reef out in Palisades Bay, where we have kind of rock piles, woven mesh of fuzzy rope that gathers mussels, and that together this builds up over time and sediments over time to create a new watery public space. And here's a view of the model of that. Right now we have a kind of micro pilot scale project going in the Gowanus Bay. There's Gina and Lucas in the office weaving the rope, and the idea is that over time, we're going to be testing the ideas of Oyster Texture here, and we can think about their larger scale implementation. So finally, the most recent studio we worked on was called Estuarine, Hudson River Studio. And for this studio, hopefully Isan and Margarita are here. For this studio, we worked with students to kind of reimagine scenarios for island building and reclaiming the edge of the Hudson River. And what was really important, I think, was to look more at the dynamics of the Hudson River as a whole. So this is one student who was looking at, I don't know if you can see this, this is the North Harlem River water treatment plant and the former sanitation shed next to it. One student incorporated dredge and sludge in a system of islands that were then deployed and cleaned in the DOS shed that were cleaned and deployed as landscape. And he studied these sedimentation patterns over time and landscape growth over time. And then he also looked at how these different islands that could be deployed to attenuate waves and make calmer water that people could have access to. So it's a dredge and sludge deployment project that really looked at the larger systems of the city. And it's always a landscape, a working landscape in progress. And then finally, the studio was broken into two groups, and they each did a kind of framework plan of how dredge could be deployed in the harbor to address the issues of storm surge and sea level rise. One group of students came up with this idea of what we're calling a necklace. And it's basically a deployment of a series of islands and wave barriers in this necklace shape that stretches from Governor's Island up to lower or mid-Manhattan. And one student began to explore this in more detail in her project and began to connect Governor's Island to lower Manhattan. She studied precedents such as the Samakudu landfill, a fascinating precedent project in which an island that consists of trash and has become kind of a UNESCO heritage site because of its wildlife habitat. And so she began to study in detail different typologies of island and different scenarios of building, connecting, and constructing this landscape to enable kind of boats to pass, but also people to potentially pass. She began to program these islands and landscapes and study how they would be constructed from both sort of a hard to a soft scenario.